My name is Tracey Nguyen Mang, and I'm the founder and creator of the Vietnamese Boat People podcast, a nonprofit. We are an organization based here on the East Coast, and our mission is to preserve the stories of the Vietnamese diaspora. And we share the stories and we preserve them mainly through our podcast, which is available for free. And also we have listeners all over the world, but we do other things like storytelling events, conversation kits, community events. And really our goal is to encourage generations to participate in preserving these stories.
Welcome to The Vietnamese. I'm your host, Kenneth Nguyen. Being part of a culture of nearly 100 million Vietnamese people in the world today comes with a lot of pain, proud history, and privilege. Join me as I highlight and explore the Vietnamese experience from all over the world.
How has becoming or evolving into your identity as a Vietnamese person changed over the years?
It's changed a lot. And I think, as cliche as it sounds, I think the biggest change happened when I became a parent. When you're younger, and especially like you and I growing up in such a hybrid cultural world, right, where we're Vietnamese American, and sometimes you don't feel really Vietnamese or American, and you're kind of stuck in this like hybrid world. And so you're navigating that throughout your life. But then when I became a parent, it became very clear to me that I wanted to raise my children with the same culture and values that I had growing up. And I think when I was younger, I was kind of navigating that in a way where like sometimes I would want to shut the Vietnamese side of me behind, right? The trauma, the history, sometimes it was just too much. But then other times, you wanted to embrace it. And I think when you become a parent, you want to embrace it all because you start to kind of like question your past and how it makes you as a parent. You start to have more appreciation of your own parents and what they had to go through to raise you and the entire family. And so for me, it is evolved in so many different ways and directions. But I think the one that has really defined my purpose the most is becoming a parent and realizing that I really valued everything that my parents taught me and our culture and our heritage. And I want to pass those things along to my own children.
Now, your partner and my partner, they're not Vietnamese, right? Well, I know partners.
No, so my husband is, yeah. So that's where my last name Mang came from. So my husband is half Chinese and half Irish. That makes it harder to raise the children in 100% Vietnamese household. I struggle with that too early on in parenting. Right, where with the first child, I tried to speak Vietnamese to her all the time because I was like, I want her to like speak Vietnamese like I do and the way I was raised. And it becomes hard, right? Because I'm the only one in the family that speaks it. And then with the second child, you get lazy and you don't have the same discipline. So unfortunately, my kids are not bilingual. My daughter is a little bit better than my son in terms of understanding, but it's a struggle every day.
Yeah. I think it's hard. I think it's impossible.
I don't know if it's impossible, but it definitely takes a lot of like intentional focus as a parent. Like, I don't know if you did this, but when I was growing up, my parents sent us to Vietnamese summer school. And like, I hated it. I'm sure you hated it because it's summer. And the last thing you want to do is spend 8 hours in a classroom learning Vietnamese. But now it's like, I wish something like that existed for my children. I don't know if I'd send them the whole summer, but I definitely would send them to some sort of immersion.
Yeah. And I think that's why the work that we do is so important, especially to us. But I don't know how important it is to them. I always fantasize that my son or daughter in their late ages are going to pull them up to listen to them. I don't think that, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, it's going to mean much, but I think it's going to be relevant to them at some point. But it's just not in the cards for them. And I don't know how how to impact that. And even if we can impact it, if it's even important for that generation. I think the work that I do is more for myself. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, it's hard to say because generationally, I think, like our generation, I feel like we're very heavily influenced by the history of Vietnam and our parents' diaspora experiences, right? And to your point, like, do the younger generations feel that as much? I don't know. I think it depends on the individual. I think, though, and this is a general statement, but I think at some point in everyone's life, they become curious.
Yeah.
And they want, it's part of like developing your own self-identity. You become a little bit more curious on your background. You become a little bit more appreciative of family history or friends or, whomever your loved or close ones are. And I do think at some point you do, get intrigued and want to learn more. Now, whether or not that's going to like last or whether or not that's going to push them forward in the spaces that you and I are in, probably not. But I think the work that we do will be valuable and of interest at some point in their lives.
Yeah. And the beauty has been for me, and I'm sure that, hopefully you can talk about this. The people that reach out are sometimes some of the most least expected that reach out and moments that are so touching and moving.
Yeah, we have like, when I started the podcast, it was just, first of all, it wasn't like this big thought out plan. It kind of just happened. It's very organic. Like I was going through my own journey where I had children and, my dad turned 80 and I just was like, oh gosh, mom and dad, like, I don't know how much longer they're going to be around. And, at the time when I started the podcast, my son was 2. And my daughter was like, they're only 20 months apart. So she was also around her toddler years. And, obviously too young to even begin talking about any of this. Right. And so I just had this like moment of like, oh my gosh, like if mom and dad are gone, I don't even know like how to tell this story properly.
Wow.
Like, and I don't know enough about our family's history. And so I felt this sense of urgency to begin recording their stories. And so literally bought the Blue Yeti, which is like the infamous, starter microphone for so many people, and my laptop. And I took the Amtrak down to Northern Virginia where my parents were. And I just asked them, if I could like interview them. And I told them it's to preserve it for, my children, our nieces and nephews. And they were so like willing. And I did the same with my brothers. And so I had just this collection of recordings that I had no idea what to do with. Yeah, I would love to write a book, but I'm not a writer. And I wasn't like, I didn't imagine myself going on like an 8-year journey of trying to write a memoir or a book. And I know a lot of people do it and it's so hard. And it just wasn't like something that I saw myself doing because I just wasn't a natural writer. And I don't know. I just felt like I had these recordings and I had to do something with it. I had to tell the world. And through just a whim, I love podcasting. This was back in 2018. And I said, you know what? I'm going to like learn how to edit this and do a mini series of my family story. And that was kind of how the podcast began. Wow. So chapter 1 is my family story. And I took classes at like a local film center to learn how to like craft a story and edit my own sound and podcast. And from that, I actually started organically getting feedback. I'd started an Instagram account and I was getting feedback that says, wow, finally there's a story about Vietnamese boat people. Like it's so amazing. And oh my gosh, listening to your dad talk about the escape, that's like my dad. And so people started sharing and I realized I wasn't alone in this journey. Like there were so many other people like me, just what I call like the 360, trying to reconnect to their heritage and their past, trying to make sense of all of it, trying to preserve it. Because, our parents' generation, is an aging one. And so that's when I decided to convert it to a nonprofit. And I said, you know what, I'm going to help bring more of these stories forward. Just everyday people who have these amazing stories that aren't shared more widely. And I'm going to hopefully encourage people to share at home, hopefully educate and bring more awareness to what our stories are all about in our own words. And so the first few solicitation of asking people to share their stories was not an easy one. Like some people are like, who are you? And what's a podcast? And, this wasn't so long ago, but podcasts I don't think was as mainstream. At least to people who weren't really into that media space, right?
Yeah.
But I just curated some stories, and then some people went to me. The first few episodes we have after my family stories was actually when I posted it. I got Leo Larson, who was one of the seamen that rescued 2 boats of Vietnamese refugees. He contacted me, showed me his newspaper clipping when it happened in the 80s, and said, hey, this moment always stuck with me for my entire life.
Wow.
And so I started talking to him, and then I was like, Leo, I'd love to share your story in the podcast. And then we shared some other stories of humanitarians that volunteered at the refugee camps, who are also in their 80s now.
Wow.
So I captured their stories. But once I had those first few, it became easier. People started to trust what I was trying to do. And then after that, other people came to me and said, hey, I love what you're doing. Can I volunteer to help you? And that's how we became a Vietnamese Boat People team of just people who are passionate about these stories, creators, and, want to be in this space to shape our narratives. But it's been a very organic journey, and not thought out at all. I mean, it was just kind of developed as it goes and as we got feedback.
One thing that I'm picking up on is this idea of organic growth. And I think that if the growth is not organic and it's coming from a place of, because there's a lot of people who start these sort of podcasts, and the longevity of it is tricky because the organic side of it, if it's not coming from a place of curiosity or something that's really relevant to your experiences growing up, it's hard to sustain and find that pocket of that rhythmic pocket that you just continue to go, because it's not an easy thing to do.
It's not easy, and there's little money in it unless you're some of the big podcasts, right? So if people start podcasting to make money, it's probably the wrong idea.
Yeah, it's not at all the right idea. It's
No.
very, very wrong to. It's like becoming a singer, I think. You can't become a singer if you're looking for the money.
Yeah.
You really enjoy, performing and singing and the musicality. You really have to really get into it.
Yeah. And it's, for me, it's just I'm motivated personally by it. And, it's when I started it out, I wasn't thinking we would have millions of listeners. I wasn't thinking we'd be all over the New York Times. It would be great. And we have had some pretty big media coverage, but again, organic. And I just thought, what? There's a very small niche group that's interested in these stories, and I'm absolutely fine with that.
Yeah.
And so our affinities and our supporters, our listeners and our supporters have a strong affinity to what we do. And I think that's the most important thing. But I'm constantly thinking about what next, because I think, when we started this out, there were not as many Asian American stories out there in mainstream media that is broadcasting for free, that is accessible for all. And now there's a lot more, which is amazing. And there wasn't a lot of Vietnamese specific ones either. And so I feel we're at such a pivotal moment right? For Vietnamese Americans. I mean, look at the movie that you guys just launched.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just incredible. And like all these Vietnamese American authors and creators and filmmakers and artists. And so, you know, I'd love to kind of think about how do we be a part of helping to elevate that beyond just our podcast. But I also really, the other part of like why I'm so passionate about this is because I didn't grow up feeling like this huge sense of pride of being Vietnamese.
Right.
That's the truth,
Yeah.
right? I grew up wanting to be American. I grew up wanting to be financially secure because it was like living paycheck by paycheck every day growing up because my parents were trying to make ends meet, and we have 7 kids. I'm the youngest of 7. So my gosh, like, I don't know how they do it. I have 2 kids and I'm like barely surviving emotionally. But, you know, so there was just so many factors and complexities and, you know, like our generation, we just didn't have this confidence to voice who we are. And we're still, you know, everything just felt so like entwined, and like we couldn't make sense of what our identity was supposed to be in America, right? Or for our generation, etc. So all of those things I didn't really like, I didn't take pride in. And then also, you know, when we were growing up, it's like when they teach about the Vietnam War in public schools, like I was almost embarrassed by it.
Yeah.
Because it's like that's what people associated you with, right? The Vietnam War. Oh, you were a refugee, and it felt like a stigma.
It was a stigma. It was clearly a stigma. You know, for men of my generation, we were zipper heads, we were VCs, we were the enemy. But it's like, wait, you guys have no idea. Like our parents served on the same side, and then the women are depicted as, you know, prostitutes, working women, you know, at the bars, and so that carries on in our generation, and it's like this unspoken, it's traumatic. It
is, and so and then, you know, you don't see yourself represented anywhere like through your own voices, right? It's all through what the media has shaped you, what the politics and the war has shaped your identity to be. And so, you know, part of what's so important to me in the nonprofit organization that I've created is that I just want to instill pride. I want to encourage people to share. Hopefully, by listening to our stories or attending our events or participating, they feel a sense of connection, even if they're not the ones sharing. They can at least relate to it and not feel so alone. And also, I think for ones that maybe already have a sense of identity or confidence, but maybe they're not feeling like they connect with their family members or their parents. Like we get a lot of listeners that said, you know, they never really quite felt like they understood their parents and why they are a certain way or why they act a certain way. And hopefully by sharing stories, it, you know, gives them a different perspective on what their parents' upbringing have been like or experiences. And so, you know, the mission of our nonprofit is just to really encourage that, to encourage like exploration, to encourage like your own personal journey at the pace that you want to go, but to also like encourage story sharing. And we always tell people, like, you don't have to be a content creator to participate or join our events. I mean, geez, like I wasn't in this media space when I started, right? But like everybody has a story to share. And, you know, hopefully we're building a community that gives each other agency to do that.
Yeah, and we are, you know, going back to what you said about releasing Micah, you're like, oh, look at that today, right? Look at what we've done. But I'm going to tell you something. This is my 6th movie. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is my 6th film in the last, I don't know, maybe 12 years. And the first 5 films, I can tell you, were great movies. They were great films. And nobody came out to support the way this has turned out.
Timing is everything.
Yeah.
Timing is everything, because you know why? The community was not ready. And I'm not just even saying like the Vietnamese community, like the American community wasn't ready to embrace movies like this, you know? And so I think timing is everything, but it's, first of all, better late than never. Right? Because it's only going to, I imagine it's only going to go up from here for the younger generations, right? Hopefully. But, it's great that we can experience it now because we didn't have any of this. And just like, so in New Jersey recently, and I know this is happening in other states, they're passing in the board education to have AAPI history a part
Wow.
of, the education curriculum. And it was never like, imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
Asian American history was never taught in like regular public school system, maybe in like private school, more so in collegiate than it is in like high school and under.
It's crazy.
But like
Mm-hmm.
so crazy when you think about like Chinese and Japanese Americans, like the history of their lives here in America, and still they're not taught in history books the way that their stories deserve. It's like crazy, but it's happening now. And it's exciting that my children, by the time they reach high school, hopefully it will be a full curriculum that they'll be exposed to.
What are some of the podcasts that inspired you and you listened to before you started yours?
Yeah, so there were non-Vietnamese or Asian specific, but there are three that really like inspired me and helped me think about how I wanted to shape Vietnamese boat people.
I'm so excited to hear this because I geek out when it comes to this podcast stuff.
So believe it or not, the first one was How I Built This.
Okay, Guy Raz.
Yes, and the reason was because first of all, I love the intimacy of the conversations that he has with the entrepreneurs. And so I wanted to create that where it felt like, these stories are personal, intimate stories of the Vietnamese diaspora. And a lot of the interviewees have never shared this, not even with their own family members. Like I've had people like sons and daughters listen to my show and say, you know what, my dad like actually never one of our episodes, The Perfect Storm, Michelle, who's the daughter, reached out to me and said, oh, could you preserve my dad's story? Because we heard bits and pieces of it, but I can't really make sense of it. And once we released his episode, she sent me this heartfelt email that said, wow, that's incredible. Like, I had no idea that was my dad's story.
Wow.
She was like, he told me bits of it, but like nothing in the level of detail that he shared with you. And so like, for me, it felt like I wanted to create a conversation that they felt comfortable in and trusted me, who is actually a complete stranger, but trusted me enough to share their most intimate moments and traumatic experiences. And so Guy Raz, I felt like How I Built This, the entrepreneurs shared both the good and the bad. And there was just so much grit behind how they were just like striving to grow this big idea they had into an actual organization, company, and worth millions or billions.
Yeah.
And so that really inspired me, the format and the intimacy and the grittiness behind it. This American Life, which I loved because, they have featured a couple of Vietnamese boat people stories before, but they're one-offs. Like every now and then they might do an episode, right?
Yeah.
So This American Life and Story Corp were two kind of similar ones that I love because they're just about like normal everyday people sharing their stories. And so I liked how it wasn't about well-known people. And so I always say 80% of the people we interview are just everyday people.
Yeah.
And so 20% are like Vietnamese American authors or filmmakers. We had Bao Nguyen on our show. So, that other 20%, it's because they're interesting people. And we hope, they can share that being in the creative space is not something that you should shy away from because, growing up, our parents taught us to be practical and not be artistic. And so, we like to share that side of the story too. But the last one I would say is Serial. And it is so like left side and just so different from what we do. But what I loved about Serial is, the fact that there is some narration and there is like a journalistic kind of fact base behind it. And so with our podcast, it's mostly told in first person, but it is curate it and edit it, and I do narrate over some of the story. And really the intention is because if you're a first-time listener or you're just new to this part of history, there are, facts about some of these historical events that adds context to what the story is about. And so Serial kind of does that in its way. And so I thought, you know what, throughout the story, if someone is talking about Operation Baby Lift, it'd be good to provide some context on what that program was about and how many children were impacted and et cetera. So those were the ones that I think, I was definitely listening to at the time, but was really kind of like influencing me and had me noodling about how I wanted our show to be.
Yeah, those are three ironclad, foundational, if I was, a person that knew nothing about nothing, those three would be among the top podcasts that exist. The thing about Guy Raz is interesting is when you listen to his stuff today, there's still a lot of ums and ahs.
I know.
I
miss the early years because now he's got tons of ads in between. Like the other day I was doing a drive and I was listening to a show and I think it ended up being like an hour and 45 minutes because there was just all these inserts of ads.
How many ads did he have?
Yeah, he has ads at the beginning and then he has 2 breaks in the middle and then he has some at the end. And I don't know. For me, I know you need the ads because you got to make the money.
You can forward the ads though too, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit harder when you're driving to kind of space it because then you end up fast forwarding too much and etc. But I do miss the early years because I think with everything, with every show and every podcast, right? It's like the early years when it feels like a little bit like startup-y, right? There's just something raw about it.
Yeah.
And when he started, it was the same thing. He was like, I started this just because I love the idea and I'm passionate about it. And I'm always curious about these entrepreneurs. And he's like, I had no idea it was going to be like this major, show that people would tune into and love so much. But he also just started something on a whim. And I know he has a whole journalistic career behind him.
I was just going to say.
But the idea of the show was really just like, I think this would be fun.
Yeah.
And so, I know. I missed the early years though.
Yeah. He's a veteran in this space. He's got big teams and he's got a lot of experience. He makes it look easy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. His today, I mean, the most recent one I listened to was this one on the Leatherman. There's a tool. There's a Leatherman tool. It's like a Swiss army of tools. And it's about this white guy who went to college and was kind of like discovering himself. And then he went into the common area at school and he met this beautiful woman. And it unfolds, right? And you realize it's a Vietnamese woman. And the Vietnamese woman takes him back to Vietnam. And that's where the birth of the Leatherman.
That episode.
It's
no,
so
I haven't listened.
Fascinating. I use that Leatherman tool. I have it. And just to know the origin on how that tool was built and how the Vietnamese sort of like the landscape, because when he went back, it was like during the war or before the war, and you would watch these little boys fix bicycles and motorbikes, and he was like getting involved with it, and he didn't know anything about engineering or anything. And you hear Guy Raz bring it out, and the artful way that the story unfolds is so beautiful. And you're like, wow, the origination of the idea came from Vietnam, and it's just such a beautiful episode.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, just his style was, something that really influenced me because, he's interviewing these people, but it's not like a Q&A. Like it's really storytelling. He takes the listener, like it's a simple interview, but he does it in a way where he takes the listener from the beginning to a peak of that entrepreneur's story, right? And then kind of then takes it to an ending. But it's well crafted. And you're right, there's tons of ums and he stutters through his questions sometimes. But I think that's sort of like the natural organic feel that is probably intentional for him.
For sure.
Yeah.
I find it so inspiring though to have that intentional ums and ahs not taken out. It's really inspirational. Now, how do you select your stories? What makes it to the, what makes it to the screen? What makes it to the
Yeah,
podcast?
so our nonprofit in general, we do we record a lot of stories, more so pre-pandemic than now, because we were physically in communities doing pop-up recording events, just to encourage people to share. But in terms of curating what actually gets into the podcast, it's never that someone's story isn't good enough, because I don't want that to ever, be the reason. It's really because we're seasonally based, which means that every season I try to pick a select of stories that revolve around a theme. So this year's theme for season 5 is Lost and Found. And it's just about people or things or places or identities that we've lost and the journey in trying to reclaim that or mend or heal. And so that's broad enough where we could go to the recordings that we have and pick some out. Also, I think we try to pick ones that we feel haven't been covered. Because, when you say boat people, refugees, I mean, everyone's going to be like, oh, they escaped by boat. They were at sea. They landed at a refugee camp. Yeah, there's a lot of those commonalities. But there's actually some very unique experiences along the way that an individual has, or their own family background is unique, or how they've interpreted that experience, like what they chose to do or not do with those experiences. So we try to find elements of their stories that we feel we haven't covered in previous episodes. And so those are the ones that we pick and we curate. And I make it sound like it's so organized and stuff, but it's really not. At the end of the day, it's still very like ad hoc and organic. I do have a lineup of like stories that we share, but it's still very like as we go, right? And so, it's important for us though to kind of bring different voices to the show. Multi-generational voices is important. And when I spoke about the volunteers that were non-Vietnamese that we profile, like it's also important for us to not only focus on certain profiles, but we tried to do people that were involved in the history. We also have stories of adoptees. So, just Vietnamese adoptees and what it means for them now, being Vietnamese when they grew up, raised by American parents, when they grew up like knowing nothing about, the country in which they were born. So we do try to cover a variety as well.
Can you imagine? This is what I was imagining in the last few weeks when I think about your podcast and interviewing you. This is what I was going through in my mind was, can you imagine if this technology, if this information was around, let's say in 1975, right? And you had like years of these episodes, and we spoke English or French or whatever that we can understand these podcasts. Then, our parents, not that they're in Vietnam, but let's just say this was a Thai thing or somebody in Southeast Asia, Korea or whatever, and this sort of thing existed. Let's say for the Ukrainian people today, that they could hear the situations that humans have gone through of loss and found and evolution of their own trajectories in their life, and how inspiring it is to know that on the other side of all of this death and destruction, that there's hope and there's light. And I think not only just in a literal sense when people are listening like Ukrainians, but also in a metaphorical sense where we can get these stories and we can be inspired and motivated to live life and not worry too much about the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, it would be amazing. And there are shows right now capturing, the experiences of the Afghan refugees or Ukrainian refugees. And so that's happening now. But the people that are, experiencing the migration, they don't have the time to listen to it, even if the technology is available right now. Like they're not listening to the coverage, right? And so it's just, it's not what's your main priority right now. It's just survival is your main priority. So even if it existed for our parents, I'm not so sure, they would have the time to sit there and kind of reflect on it. To be honest, I think they were just in survival mode, like today's refugees. What's interesting about our show, well, I mentioned why I started the podcast, but there were so many other factors that were happening around 2018 that was just like had me itching everywhere that, I needed to put these stories out there. One of them was just, the presidential election at the time. And the fact that like we had a president administration that was just closing our borders and not taking in any more migrants. I felt like people needed to understand why people choose to flee their country. And, if given the choice, most people wouldn't want to do it because it's starting a new life, new culture, new language. And oftentimes it's dangerous journeys, right? So like these stories that we air in our podcast was meant to create some empathy around the refugee experience, right? Why these families and individuals like would choose these life-threatening journeys. Because sometimes it's the last resort. Sometimes it's desperation. So, there's multiple complexities behind why families flee. And so by listening to stories of refugees, even if it's a past historical war, it will hopefully create more empathy. And so that was important to me too, because I felt like a lot of times stories of refugees get covered by journalists or academia doing, studies and stuff like that, but they're not covered and told directly by the people who've lived through those experiences. And so that was an important part of the podcast, was to share those first accounts, those, first person stories, and in a way that would hopefully create more compassion for today's migrants. But the other thing was, we started getting a lot of listeners that are non-Vietnamese. So I did a listener survey. I don't know if I told you this, but I did a listener survey last year and we still have it. It's ongoing. But I just assumed all of our listeners were Vietnamese. And it turns out only about 60% are. Wow. Yes. I mean, that's incredible, right? And we naturally get a lot of like Vietnam veterans that tune in. We get a lot of like academia and students that are studying about Asian American history or the Vietnam War or just critical refugee studies that have found our podcast. And some professors have assigned it as supplemental learning to their syllabus. But the one thing that really stood out to me in the survey was like, we had asked, there was one question, I don't remember the exact wording of it, but we had asked something to the fact of, why do you listen to this? And it was a multiple choice and they could check as many as they want, right? And it was like, because I am an immigrant or refugee, or because my family is of an immigrant or refugee. And over 80% of our listener was because they come from immigrant backgrounds. And so even though they weren't Vietnamese, they could relate to these stories because they're, family or at some point refugees or immigrants. And I think that's an important factor, is because our stories are much broader than just the Vietnamese diaspora. It's the migrant experience. It's a story about human spirit, right? Like people having grit and resilience and the willpower to fight through challenges and, for a better life. And at the end of the day, I always say these are just stories about the human spirit. Like it's beyond just, Vietnamese.
It's universal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And the idea of the universal side of things, if we can't get to that, then, how valued, I don't know. It's not valuable, because if we can't connect to it on a universal level with universal themes, then it's sort of just kind of for a very small percentage of people. And that leads me to the next thing, which is this idea of I don't know, it's trauma fatigue for me. I on one point, on one side, I need to keep talking about like the pain and the suffering that we went through, but on the other side of it, I'm like, I'm going through the fatigue. I want to see what the next evolution of our Vietnamese culture, Asian American history, what's the next step for all of us, and I wanted to ask you that today.
Oh, yes, I know. So yeah, I'm working on some ideas for me personally, that I'm quite not ready to share. But I think there is a fatigue. I don't think the journey of healing is done. And again, I think it's an individual journey. So, I think for us, we probably feel the fatigue a little bit more because we're in this space. And so we're exposed to it a lot more, than maybe a typical person who's not like thinking about this all the time. So I still think the journey, is ongoing. In terms of what's next, though, I feel like there is still, unanswered questions, not necessarily the trauma, but how does the trauma evolve, or how do we get past it? Right. And I think, that is a major question that I would love to begin exploring, not only in younger generations, but in our parents' generation, right? Like, I think there's a lot of people who have gotten past the trauma, who have actually put it aside and moved on and taken it for what it's worth. And there are others that are still healing from it, right? Still have not opened those wounds since they left Vietnam. And so I think it just varies. But what I'd love to see is a mixture of, dialogue that starts to talk about, how do we move past the trauma? What closures do we still need? At what point do we continue to carry the South Vietnam flag, or put it aside and recognize today's flag? I don't know. Wow. And I think those are questions we need to ask and explore,
I'm
right?
so glad that you brought that up. The flag in particular, Vietnam just won the Asian soccer SEA Games like a few weeks ago. And that flag was waved in millions of scooters and motorbikes as they were parading through the city. And it was like shoulder to shoulder. And I felt like that high school kid that was sitting by himself in the cafeteria while all the cool kids were like hanging out and having lunch together. And I couldn't, personally, what was going on in my mind was like, oh, this sucks. Because I can't really, I can, but I can't, as somebody who's working in this space, we can't really show that. And I'm like, God damn it. I'm kids of veterans and the South Vietnamese government, South Vietnamese army, family members that died, grandparents that suffered. My grandfather died at the hands of this evolution of this current regime. And well, at this point, hasn't it gone long enough? Yeah.
I don't know. And honestly, I feel like maybe the evolution is for us to ask those questions. Or maybe it won't actually ever disappear completely. Maybe the younger generations will slowly put that flag down, but I don't know. But I feel like in our narrative, when we say, how do we get past the trauma? I don't know if I don't know if I would necessarily say, how do we get past it, but how do we confront it?
Get through it.
Yeah. How do we confront it? How do we question it? How do we think, shape the evolution of what's next for our community? And I think there's a huge opportunity, like we said, to do that, right? Because growing up, first of all, not only were we afraid to speak up outside in the American world, but inside our homes, we were afraid to speak up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think nowadays, I know the younger generations are less afraid. I know my kids will talk back to me any moment they get. And they're just brought up in an environment where they, are kind of taught to have a little bit more confidence, to voice their opinion and to share a perspective. And that's good. That's growth. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like we should question it. I feel like it's worth talking about.
Pretty courageous for even bringing that up, because you specifically said it. I was like, okay, you're going to blow the doors open. I'm going to go with you here.
I have a story that I've told on a couple of talks before, but so I went to business school at Thunderbird School of Management, and it's mainly known for international management. And it's got a lot of international students in the student body in general. So it's tradition in the graduation ceremony that different groups from different kids from different countries will hold their flag walking down the ceremony. And of course, I think I was the only Vietnamese person in my graduating class. So they asked me to hold it, and it was the flag with the star. And my parents were at my graduation, and it's not that I didn't know that they still recognize the stripe, but I just thought, hey, this is a ceremony. I've been asked to carry this just to represent that I'm Vietnamese. And my God, my parents freaked out before I even walked down the aisle. My brother was like pulling me aside, was like, you cannot do this. He's like, Mom is sitting out there crying because you're about to hold that flag down the ceremony. This was 2006.
Oh, that's so early.
And you know what? It obviously it clicked for me, but I was like, wow. Like, I was like, she's crying. Like, she knows this is just for part of the graduation ceremony. It's like no ill intent of any kind, right? To say north, south, or whatever. It's just to say, hey, we've got, Vietnam represented in the student body. Of course, I didn't go through with it. I had to tell the event coordinator that I wasn't feeling well, because you don't want to go through the whole backstory of why you can't walk down, 2 minutes before the ceremony. But it really hit home for me that I don't think my parents will ever get past it in their living generation.
Can I ask you something?
I get it. Yeah.
Can I ask you today, if you were walking down the graduation aisle, what would you do today with the same scenario? Your mom's in the stands. You are who you are with all of the media experience. How would you approach it today?
Oh, this is such a great question. I have to say, I know this is going to sound so bad, and I hope my listeners don't think poorly of me, but there is just a huge sense of loyalty that I have to my parents. And I want to emphasize that, because honestly, I was born after the war. Anything I know about Vietnam is through what's been told to me. So I didn't experience the divide, right? So I don't have this tremendous loyalty to North or South, but I do have tremendous loyalty to my parents and respect for what they've gone through. And for those reasons, I probably wouldn't go through it knowing now how my mom would react, right? I didn't think about it then. I was also young then and not like in this space, right, where I'm dissecting the theories and what it means. So I wouldn't, but whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. And that's why I think having the discussion about what's next for our community, and I think it will evolve. I mean, I think a lot of how we feel is what's been passed on to us, right, from our parents.
I love your answer. It's honest, and nobody can challenge that because it's honest, and they can come at you with trying to perhaps persuade you with the new way of looking. But at the end of the day, I mean, your love, my love for our parents, it trumps everything. Now, maybe if they pass away, it's still not going to be natural to change that ideology of that flag, the semiotics of that flag. It's
tricky topic.
Tricky topic. But then what I wonder what our kids are all half Vietnamese, right? And I really truly wonder what they're going to think in 30 years when they're, there's going to be some pride because they have, my kids are Taiwanese and Vietnamese. When they look at their parents' mother country, I wonder if they're going to be as moved with the history as like a fifth generation Irish person on the East Coast feels, when they're at the bar and they're, drinking their Guinness and, they see the Irish flag. And there's this like, well, there's a lot of built-in history that they don't know about. And they're just like
Yeah.
drinking and having a good time when Conor McGregor is fighting, in the MMA at UFC. I wonder if there's going to be a Vietnamese fighter, on MMA and they're cheering for this kid 30 years from now with the Vietnamese flag and how that's going to all play out.
With the star flag?
Our flag.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, what they're taught in school today is that the Vietnam flag is a star.
Yeah.
Like that's what my kids are taught in the American school system, right? And it is the nation's flag. So my kids are too young for me to go into the whole details of it, but because they know mommy has a podcast, my daughter's been on recording road shows with me, so she gets it more than my son. And she, is a very inquisitive kid, so she'll read about the Vietnam War at the library at the age of, she just turned 9 today, but like she's been doing that since she was 7. So I feel like it's always going to stick with her from, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but unfortunately she has a mom in this space and she's kind of exposed to it on a daily basis. So my son's different. He's not as attuned to it, just because he's younger. So I don't know the answer to that because my kids are in this space with me. But what I will say is like, when I do talks at some of the universities and, Vietnamese Student Association, VSAs, they're a combination of like Vietnamese Americans and international students from Vietnam. And it's very interesting to actually speak to the ones that came from Vietnam because, they were born, oh my gosh, some of them were born past
90s.
2000. 2000, can you imagine? I don't feel that old, but my God, we are that old.
2002, 2003. You're right. I never thought about that.
And, it's very interesting to talk to them. Number one, they're taught an entirely different narrative growing up in Vietnam, right? And then they come here and I'm speaking about Vietnamese boat people and they're intrigued, but they don't feel the same emotional connection, right, to what I'm talking about. And I've also spoken to some that, when they first arrived in the US, they hung their Vietnam flag in their rooms. And they're living with an aunt and uncle who was like freaking out, going into the room and was like, you cannot hang that here. And they're like, what? Like, so it's, I don't know. I think they just grow up with, I don't, for lack of a better word, I'm going to say less baggage. And I think we can expect that baggage will get lighter with the history and it'll probably develop their own history for, that's important to their generation.
I would love to see more podcasts coming from the younger generation and more podcasters in our space in general. And I talked to Randy and you and I have talked. I'm putting a message out there to the public that I think we should have a lot more podcasters that are Vietnamese because of the amplification process that happens with podcasting and the dialogue about the flag and the evolution of our position can be normalized, if there's more conversation. And unfortunately, there's only a handful of people doing this. And I think that I am always begging and pleading with friends of mine in the public space to do podcasts because, can you imagine if there's like 20, 30 of us that are, in 5 years from now, where we can go on each other's shows, we can share audience. You're doing work that's very different from the work that I'm doing, but at the same time, we're working towards the same thing, which is open discussion. just trying to figure out things and debating and having these open forums of thoughts being exchanged. And I think that that's a very healthy place to be. So one thing that I look forward to that we've talked about is having a group podcast session with Randy.
Yes, I know. We have to set the date.
Yeah.
And it'll be so much fun because podcasters, we love to talk. We'll definitely have a lot to talk about. I'd agree with you. I don't know if I necessarily would say it doesn't have to be just in the podcast space in terms of younger generations. I think that, first of all, I feel like there's tons of content creators out there in that generation. There's just so much technology at their fingertips, and that they have found different ways to, have dialogue, share their own points of views and stuff like that. So what I would say is that I would love to, I'd love to have them talk about, like you said, specific topics that we don't necessarily feel like we should talk about, right, publicly. And gosh, if my parents listen to me, they'll be like, like they're probably going to be like shaming me or something. But I just come from the mindset that, like, it's healthy to talk about it. But also, I don't think it's disrespecting history. I think it's about moving forward, right? And sometimes people feel like you can't move forward without, like, not, disrespecting what has happened and what it's meant to people. And I don't think that's true at all, right? So I think it's important to have these dialogues, and whether or not it's on a podcast, I would love for, like you said, younger generations to, strike up the conversation in whatever medium that they're most comfortable with.
I mean, let's project out into the future about this flag dialogue real quick. Just imagine if the previous generation they're no longer here. Our parents are no longer here, and we are now in our 60s, and that flag is flying everywhere. What is going to happen at that point? Do you think that there's people in our generation that's going to bang the drums and be like, no, we got to keep the 3 red stripes? Really?
I do. And
that's dark.
and like I said, it's not that I don't know if it's right or wrong, is what I'm trying to ask that question, right? Like, I think there's just different points of views on it. But do I think it will fade away completely? No, because I don't think anything ever fades away completely. I think there's always going to be people that hold on to the past for whatever, like, internal reasons that gives them, the passion to do so. And whether or not it's right or wrong, I don't know. But I do think it's going to be less so. Because, again, I think, generations from now, that flag becomes a historical figure versus an actual experience, right? And so the emotional connection to it just changes.
I mean, you're right. I mean, I'm not comparing the old, thing to anything, but if you look in the history of the United States, there's a flag from the South. We're not going to name it, but that still holds
exactly
identity.
And there's still beliefs, right?
I've actually,
what is civil rights? I mean,
I've made comparisons to that a few times, and my friends are like, no. That's very,
can't go there.
It's not the same. And I'm like, no, that's not what I meant. But
no, you can't go there. It's not the same. However, it is in terms of what we're trying to like
analogous
portray, right?
Yeah, the vestiges. Do you go to Vietnam?
I used to go a lot more often than now. My last time was in 2013. So right before my first kid was born. It was like the big trip before, we start a family.
Oh, so you haven't been back in a while.
No. And, then COVID happened, and now it's like, I would like to take my mom back with my kids.
Has she been?
Oh, my mom used to go all the time. She hasn't been in the last few years because she's just much older, and the trip is so like exhausting for her. Yeah. But I used to go often. I used to have a business in my 20s of importing goods in Vietnam.
What did you import?
Shoes and accessories. I went back to Vietnam for the first time in 2000 with my sister who was in fashion design, and I fell in love with the country. I just saw so much like art and crafts and talent, and we wanted to bring that craftsmanship to the US. But this was in 2000. So, US normal trade relations was pretty recent. And I was in my 20s, first of all. We did pretty well. We got a lot of like magazine coverage. But, like, I wasn't ready to run a business. So it didn't last. It only lasted a couple years. But, I felt like at the time I was educating people on what made in Vietnam was, because at that time there weren't a lot of products that were being imported that were made in Vietnam. And so we started the company in 2000, and I was with it until 2005. So right before I left for business school. And then I did a tour with the US Embassy, a women's in business tour. So I spoke in a lot of different cities right around 2007. So I've done a lot of business trips. I don't do them as much now, though.
Well, we have the very similar trajectory in business. I was also starting out with my family business in 2000. We still run it today, but it's not. It's small. It's not as we had 250 people working for us in 2002, 2003.
It's amazing.
We've scaled down, and it's not even that many. But it's much more efficient. But Vietnam has changed so much.
Yes.
Infrastructural, the way things are done, it's not what people think it is.
No, I mean, I remember when we started. So we took, how I don't know how you say it in Vietnamese, but the artistry where they take like eggshells and they lacquer it on furniture and like dishware and stuff. So my sister designed, she took the same craftsmanship and she did clogs, like shoes. So she would do the heels of the shoes, and she would work with local artisans to do that, and we would import it. But it just became like this like big conversation of like how it's made. And I think at the time there's a lot of stuff made in China. So like we had that competition going on in terms of like we were trying to educate our consumers about something that was handcrafted and very artisanal when they were used to something that was made, a little bit more factory like on the cheap end. So it was a little bit of a struggle for us. But I do remember we also did flip-flops, and we would place orders for hundreds of flip-flops in like a set of sizes. And this is early on Vietnam, where the quality control was not always there. We would get these hundreds of shoes, and the boxes would be labeled size 6 through 10. And they would have stickers on all the shoes, but you'd open them and they were all the same size.
Oh my God.
But that's like early on what it was like. And I'm sure your company experienced like that level of quality and consistency when you're trying to like grow. And it wasn't always there in the early stages. And so I remember that too. And that was like tough trying to figure out, okay, well, what do we do with like, 500 size 6s?
Yeah, wow. And that's still going on. That whether it's in film or production or
yeah.
There's this level of I think in the US there's a level of like just follow through and commitment to the details of things that have to be done, where I think in all over Asia, not just Vietnam, I think all over Asia, that sort of like that kind of ethos is not as strict. And for better for worse, there's beautiful things about not having that strict German, Japanese sort of way of doing things. In Asia, there's a beautiful flow about that, but then at the same time, the quality control is a little bit, lacking.
Inconsistent.
Yeah. You know, how has podcasting and the work that you do, how has that changed your life?
Um, Actually, it's changed it quite a bit. So when I started the podcast, I was also in the corporate world. And I don't know if did I tell you this? So I was another point of why doing what I do became so important was because, everybody turns a decade older and then they're like, whoa, what am I doing with my life? Am I doing anything meaningful? So right around the time I had turned 40 when I started the podcast, and I was also an associate partner at a big management consulting firm, technology firm. And I just was questioning whether or not what I was doing was purposeful. Like I was putting tons of hours into my day job, right? And so when I started the podcast, I started putting a lot of hours at night. So it would be my nights and weekends in the podcast, and then I had my day job in the corporate world. And so a couple things. I learned that passion really drives work more than money and anything else I've experienced, because I was obviously not getting paid for any of this.
Right.
But my husband, and he made this comment, he was like, it is so amazing to see you staying up on a weekday after you've worked a full day of job, taken care of the kids, put them to bed, and then stay up to 2 a.m. editing the show. And he was like, I have so much admiration. And he's like, I wish I found something that I was that passionate about. And so for me, like, I just really learned how to push forward and have more confidence in myself in a space that I've never was professionally trained in. But like, I just loved it so much and I was so passionate. And so for me, it was almost like a rebirth of what it means to like do something you really love. So it changed me in that way. It also brought me closer to my parents. I've always been close with my mom, but I don't think I had a sense of appreciation for her stories as much as I do now. And my dad and I are definitely closer. When I first interviewed him, I felt like he spoke with me for 6 hours and really opened up. And we just never had that relationship growing up. Like we had a very distant relationship, mostly because he's a quiet man and I was always afraid, to like have normal conversation with him. And then when you turn 40 and your dad's 80, you're like, what the heck? We're older now. What do you have to lose? Right. And so everything becomes a little bit more like open and honest. And, I wasn't afraid to ask questions, very private ones. And he respected me for it. And because I was older, he didn't feel like he had to hide things from me. Right. And same with my mom. So I feel like this whole experience brought me closer to them. And I have a much greater appreciation for them, like a different one. Like, when you're growing up, you have so much respect for them, but it's sort of like this figure that you're afraid of.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm not afraid of them now. I just have more understanding for them. And I think that's a huge difference. The last thing I would say is I learned how to be a better leader and a manager. So I'm a type A personality. And in the corporate world, I would lead teams that I was very like detail oriented, and I would listen to people, but I always had in the back of my mind how I felt like things should be. And so it always kind of steered that way. And I was a visionary, so I was very hands-on. And I think with this nonprofit and podcast, I mean, the majority of our team are volunteers. They were 100% volunteers when we started out. But now that we are getting a little bit more grants and stuff, I'm able to pay some of our producers and people that help out. But what I've learned is to be a better leader, because when you're not paying them, I didn't feel like I had the right to be like, I want it this time, and this way. So it made me actually sit back and listen more, because I thought, well, they're clearly doing this on their own time because something is driving them to connect with this work. Something is, making them very passionate about that. And so it allowed me to listen to them more, to find spaces where they could grow, and all of them are younger than me, by the way. I'm like the old granny on the team. But, it also helped me really like see their generation's perspective. And so I feel like I've just become a better manager because I let them have the space that they need to create. And I don't know, like I don't know how to describe it, but I'm less like, I don't feel the need to be 100% or 110% hands-on as I would have when I was in like the corporate world.
Which, Tracey, today you were so gracious to open up with so many of the stories and share with me, the journey that you've been through, and it's very valuable and it's invaluable to me. So I want to tell you how much I thank you. And I look forward to many more of these with you and with other podcasters. And, the next 20 years of our life on earth, I hope that we can work together to amplify and to get the stories, the discussions in our world out.
Oh, yes, me too. And I hope that this is only the beginning of many more conversations. And I'd love to do things together in the future, like beyond podcasting, right? Because we're much stronger as a community and as creators when we work together to share these stories. So I'd love to do that.
Yeah. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, Kenneth.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. The Vietnamese is produced by Brittany Tran. Special thanks to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can subscribe, like, and comment. Please rate and give us a review wherever you find our podcast. Thanks again for listening.